The challenge we're facing in the world right now is that our vulnerability hasn't really gone down, but uncertainty is bouncing all over the place, which makes it really hard for us to be vulnerable, to reach out for help, to try new things. You know, we're seeing this level of anxiety, particularly in young people, that we've never seen before.
Put that coffee down.
Creators are leaders. Be careful what kind of leaders you're producing here.
Helen, we're both in sales.
Let me tell you why I suck as a salesman.
They realized that to be in power, you didn't need guns or money or even numbers. You just needed the will to do what the other guy wouldn't.
I'm not leaving. The show goes on.
Well, hello there, friend. Welcome back to the Construction Leadership Podcast. I am your host, Bradley Hartman. This episode is brought to you by the Simple Sales Pipeline. If you need a way to document, to organize and value your pipeline so you understand your future cash flow, the lifeblood of your business, you can do it in under $30 per month for under 30 minutes per month. Visit the Simple Sales Pipeline to learn more. I'm excited to bring to you today my conversation with Dr. Darryl Stickel. He's the author of Building Trust, Exceptional Leadership in an Uncertain World. And if you want a 30,000 foot view of who Dr. Darryl Stickel is, this will give you an idea. So I got the book, I read it, I was really impressed by it. We reached out to him and said, would you be willing to come on the show, share some of these insights to describe and detail how trust and vulnerability, these are decisions that you can choose to make to build more trust and to be a better leader and to have more engaging collaborative relationships. And he says, yes. Well, I get the book, I read it, and then I notice as I'm talking to him, he's got his PhD. He earned it from Duke. He wrote his thesis on building trust in hostile environments, which if you're in construction, yeah, that sounds about right. We understand that. And I look at his book and it says at the bottom, Darryl Stickel. No DR in front of it, no PhD at the end. And we work with a lot of universities. We know a lot of people who have worked very hard to earn that little doctor designation. And on more than one occasion, I have seen with me and with other people, these doctors who have earned this, when people mention their name and they do not put doctor in front of it, they take this as a slight and they are very forthcoming to say, it's Dr. Darryl Stickel or whatever. So I said, just curious, why isn't doctor on the cover of your book? You earned it. You went to Duke, fantastic university. You got your PhD. I think most people would want to shout that from the rooftops. And he said, well, I have found when we're talking about trust and I'm working with executives and doing coaching, which drives his business, me being a doctor, I think removes me from some distance from being with the people I'm trying to help. And that alone, just think about that for a minute. You go get your PhD, who wouldn't want to be a doctor, right? Like Dr. Phil or Dr. Dre or whatever, any other real doctor. You get my point. Why would you not want to put it there? You've earned it. And he's saying, if it doesn't help me and it doesn't help my clients ultimately get closer together to do this, build trust, then why would I want it there? And I think that is emblematic of who Darryl Stickel is. If you were to visit his website, trustunlimited.com, you would see that he is an executive coach with over 20 years of experience. He got his start at McKinsey & Company, where he learned a lot there. And obviously, he wrote this book, Building Trust, Exceptional Leadership in an Uncertain World, which I would recommend to a friend. He's also a former hockey player at a high level who's been through some traumatic experiences, and he's legally blind. So there's a lot here about trust and resilience and vulnerability. And my goal, which I know was achieved by bringing him here and talking to him, is going to help you think about trust in a different way and be more effective and efficient at building trusting relationships faster. So I'm excited for you to listen to my conversation. I really enjoyed it with Dr. Darryl Stickel of Trust Unlimited. As always, thank you for listening. So Dr. Darryl Stickel, welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks for having me. It's such a pleasure to be here with you and your guests.
Yeah, it's going to be a lot of fun here today. I have family who, in a couple different cities in Canada, I've got some family outside of Detroit in Windsor. And then we also have some family in Toronto. And occasionally we'll be talking to them and thinking about the geography and understanding how large Canada is. And someone will say something to the effect of, well, like 90% of all the 30 million plus Canadians, 90% of them live within 90 miles of the border.
Right.
You, my friend, are in that minority. Tell me a little bit about Fort St. John, where it is, and maybe what it was like to grow up there.
So Fort St. John's about 2/3 of the way up the province of British Columbia. It's near the start of the Alaska Highway. And there's this phrase called too cold to snow. So there were stretches where it was minus 40 for, long periods of time. Fort St. John has the unusual distinction of every month in the year, at some point or another, it has snowed. So some year in August, it snowed, or in July or June. It's a small community. When I grew up there, it was about 12 or 13,000 people. It's about an hour drive from the next really small community. A lot of natural resources, so oil and gas, mining, forestry, those kinds of things. And it was a community growing up that was really, it was rugged, but people had a sense of community. You didn't leave your neighbor stranded. You helped out if you could. I developed a real sense there of, if I could help, I should. And this notion that the strong protect the weak. And so there were plenty of negatives about growing up at Fort St. John, but there are a lot of positives as well.
Yeah, well, as we talk about your experience and your thoughtfulness and your book, which is all about trust, I can only imagine, and I might kind of interject out of just sheer curiosity about growing up in that environment when rugged, I like that term, I can only imagine, but also when you're that isolated in a small community, you have to depend on each other, right? It's a small tribe and, one of the most strictest sense of the words. And I can only imagine that has really informed how you think about trust and how you lead trust and how you coach other people that grew up in very different environments to trust more efficiently and to earn that.
Yeah, it's also driven a real sense in me of wanting to help. I feel like I have an insight that most don't around this topic. And, my whole life has really, it makes sense looking backwards. My whole life has sort of been driven to the point where I am. There were traumatic events in my life that at the moment were hard, but, sometimes a hard road's a good teacher. And so there were a series of events in my life that led me to have greater insight, that led me to have a higher level of empathy, and, that pushed me to understand this topic in a way that most don't.
Yeah, your resilience, and I think I'll use this as a segue. Your resilience is remarkable. And when I hear you say that and understand your story, I think of this quote by Steve Jobs, and I'm going to butcher it, but it's something to the effect of, you can only connect the dots in retrospect. In
Right.
the time, you're doing your best, things are happening, you're surviving, you're hopefully growing, you're getting more confident in your capabilities and understanding who you are. But to connect the dots, you got to get far enough down the road and then look in the rearview mirror. And maybe as a segue here, I'll ask you, you dedicated the book to Drake. Now, you're Canadian. My initial thought was, without reading too far, was, obviously you have a passion behind the rap music of Drake, the rapper. And then I continued reading. That is not true. So tell us who Drake is and tell us why you dedicated your book, Building Trust, to him.
So Drake is my seeing eye dog. And I tell people that his name is Drake because he can't sing. And so Drake helps me navigate the world in a way that I couldn't before. I'm legally blind. I can see a short distance and then everything becomes extremely blurry. People will ask me, how far can you see? And I'll say a couple of feet. Usually they're my own. And so Drake helps me get around in the world and he brings people to me. It was entirely possible because I was able to cope without him. People didn't always know that I was visually impaired. So I couldn't read facial cues or see expressions or body language or those sort of subtle invitations that we give to one another to be part of a community, to talk, to connect. And so it was easy for me to be alone in a crowd. Drake changed all of that. He brings people to us and connects us to the world and helps me navigate. So, yeah, I'm a huge fan of his.
That's incredible. Well, that turn of phrase you use there, the subtle invitations, I can only imagine, on one hand, I can imagine it's been a roadblock for you and kind of developing trust and thinking about it. On the other hand, it's probably given you this superpower that has forced you to develop these other senses around. And to your point, given you abilities that other people don't have, because I'm going to be honest, I've got, behind me on the shelf, there's no shortage of books on trust. And there's several ones that I really like. And there's a few of them that I'm like, this is a really good model. I'm not quite sure I needed 250 pages after the first 10, but this, and I will say, I'm going to highlight some of these questions later on. Your approach to it was very different. And that's why I was really excited to kind of talk to you there. Before we get too far though, I also wanted us to talk about, you played hockey, and there's a time where post some of these events in hockey, the idea that 20, 30 years later, you would have a PhD and you would be, one of, if not the leading expert on trust in the world, would seem like the most ridiculous idea in the world. Maybe give the audience a little context about your playing career in hockey and how that ended and the impact that it had on you mentally, emotionally, and physically.
Right. So my vision gradually declined. So when I was a teenager, I didn't see well, but I could still play hockey. And I grew up in Northern Canada, so of course I played. And I was a good player. I'm 6'3". I weighed around 200 pounds. I was the fastest guy on my team. I was playing juvenile hockey. I was a 17-year-old. We were 17 and 18. And we were playing in a junior B league, which is up to 21. And we were playing in a small community called Fort Nelson, and I got attacked by a fan of the club. And he pulled me sort of half into the crowd. There was a gap in the glass by the gate and shattered my helmet, knocked me unconscious. And then a player, I got pulled out of the crowd by my team, and one of their players grabbed me. A huge brawl erupted, and I got just the living tar beat out of me by another player. And I was virtually unconscious at the time. I got taken by ambulance to the hospital. I stopped breathing 3 times on the way there, apparently, according to one of my teammates who was in the ambulance with me. And I had a severe concussion. And, I knew growing up that my eyesight was going to fail, that I was going to lose my sight. And so I had come to the realization that I was going to have to think for a living. There were so many careers outside the possible range for me. And I was good in school. I'd done well. And then all of a sudden after this incident, I had the attention span of a fruit fly. I just couldn't focus on anything. I couldn't remember anything. And I got to tell you, the sense of loss and of devastation and helplessness and hopelessness was just profound. And, we talk about sort of retrospect. Looking back, that event triggered some real empathy for me for the struggles that others experience, and a real understanding of what it meant to be vulnerable and to feel so hopeless. And it took me years to recover. It didn't help that I kept playing hockey because we didn't know about concussions at that point. And I was 17, right? And I got to tell you, the thing I tell my sons is the last guy you ask how he's doing is the guy with the head injury, right? Because he'll say, "Oh, I'm fine."
It's dude, the word fine is going to come up about 98% of the time. I don't know. I'm fine.
Yeah. And so I went to college, failed everything, and was really struggling with fatigue and concentration and memory, and kept having, additional concussions. And I played college. Like I said, I was a good player. I played college hockey, and I think I had 3 concussions the next season, and still led the team in scoring, and, wound up in the hospital on 2 or 3 separate occasions. and, would miss stretches of games. But it was something I was passionate about. And yeah, so it was definitely part of that journey, though. The experiences I had taught me how to connect with others, what it was like to struggle, what it was like to battle, to overcome something.
Yeah. Well, and I think this is a good point here. I don't want to bury the lead in here because I think trust, in my mind, often has the same sort of unique challenges that a word like strategy or strategic has, which we throw it around all the time. And if you said to someone, how do you define that? It's almost used so commonly that people struggle with it. So how do you define trust? Because you just mentioned vulnerability, and we're going to talk about kind of your equation. Go into that a little bit. What's your definition of trust?
So trust is the willingness to be vulnerable when you can't completely predict how someone else is going to behave. And so there's an element of vulnerability and uncertainty in there. And, you're right. Wandering the earth with my guide dog, Drake, puts me in a unique position because I'm vulnerable often, right? And I have the experience. I wish everyone could have the experiences that I have. People are actually kind and giving and caring, and they want to help. And often they just need an excuse. And when they see Drake and I, they want to connect with Drake and they want to help.
It's interesting to think about. Imagine someone, maybe it was yesterday, maybe it was this morning, maybe it's someone this afternoon, that comes across you and Drake, just completely random person, and their willingness to help and their attitude, probably their nonverbal behavior, their expressions on their face, all of that. And then you take the same exact person and you say an alien comes down from, wherever, and you have to explain what it's like to deal with other humans and what life is like. They might give the most cynical answer available, thinking about social media and thinking about, the singularity in AI and like how everything's going to hell in a handbasket. And yet the same individual immediately was nothing but thoughtful and generous and wanted to help you. I find this fascinating just about human beings in general.
Yeah, we have an innate desire to want to help. And it gives us a feeling of accomplishment and meaning. I have a positive story about people. And, I've had the experience of homeless people wanting to help me and it giving a feeling of meaning for them, a sense of accomplishment. And when I work with executives, I'll often ask them about, tell me about the moments where you've actually made a positive impact in someone's life, or you've been, the word I use is benevolent, but helpful and caring. And boy, the energy in the room is just incredible. Smiles on everyone's faces, that feeling of accomplishment, that sense of, hey, I did that. I contributed. I helped.
I think it's interesting. So many people have, whether it's through corporate settings or otherwise, through the church maybe, have given their time or money philanthropically or have donated time to help something, whether it's at a food bank or whatever. And the energy and the way that makes people feel, I think a lot of us have experienced that. But then when you start thinking about how do we generate that feeling in a corporate setting, when there is money, when there is reputation, when there is ego, there's competitive advantage, all of a sudden all these other things seem like, and maybe we can talk about this, is just unnecessarily cloud over. That's the same thing we all want. We want that same feeling just with other people. And hey, can we blend in a little commerce? Darryl, is that possible? Is that too much of a dream?
No, it's absolutely possible. I've seen it, too often to believe that it's not possible. I was actually working with a group of senior executives, and we did this exercise where they were all talking about, these moments where they'd helped someone, and, the smiles and the energy, it was just off the charts. And I said, this is fantastic. Now, if you could just explain to me why you're so effing selfish. And they just kind of stopped. And I said, because you've told me how powerful and meaningful this is, but you never let anyone have that experience with you. You never ask for help. You never make yourself vulnerable. You never allow other people in. And it was a turning point for that group. And I'm happy to say that it led to some profound changes in the way that that group performed together, because they were able to start then connecting at a different level. And one of the struggles we're having, and I don't want to get too far ahead of us, but, the model for me is uncertainty times vulnerability gives us a level of perceived risk. And we each have a threshold of risk that we can tolerate. And so if our perception of the risk goes beyond that threshold, we don't trust. If it's beneath it, then we do. The challenge we're facing in the world right now is that our vulnerability hasn't really gone down, but uncertainty is bouncing all over the place, which makes it really hard for us to be vulnerable, to reach out for help, to try new things. We're seeing this level of anxiety, particularly in young people, that we've never seen before, at least not at these levels. We're seeing leaders struggle to let go of the things that got them where they are and step into new roles to be great. And all of these challenges are because uncertainty is just so high.
Yeah, I'd like to I'm going to frame this. If you'll allow me to.
Yeah,
please. I'm going to read a segment here from the beginning because I think it kind of answers the question that I had originally before getting your book, before reading, before speaking to you of, do we need more content out there? What's different? And I think this is what's different. So I'm going to read this here if I can, and then I'll ask you to just take it from there. Much of the available research treated the trust decision in terms of inputs and outputs. Inputs included things such as transparency or following through on commitments. If there were sufficient inputs, well, trust was the output. I found this unsatisfying, i.e. you did, Darryl, and ultimately unhelpful. Instead of focusing on trust as an output, I decided to center my model on trust as a decision that incorporated levels of uncertainty and vulnerability. That's exactly what you were talking about there. And this is the minute you said decision, what I find myself repeating quite frequently with our clients and those executives, given all this uncertainty, is if it's not number one, it's 1A. Your job as an executive is to make decisions. What is the decision we're making and why? So run with this and maybe give the audience and myself a little context of what was unsatisfying about what you had read and interpreted and different from what you felt, and why you want to take this more in a decision sort of framing.
Well, when we start talking about, all these inputs or antecedents or whatever you want to call them, the factors that were leading to people, it felt like they were treating trust like a black box. And it just felt like there was so much mystery involved. And it's, how many things do I have to memorize? Right? And how do I interpret them? And how do I actually take action against them? And part of my frustration still to this day is there's a lot of people talking about trust, but not talking about what to do about it. And, when I first, and I don't want to get too esoteric and, hoity-toity or whatever, but I want our audience to come with us. I like talking to real people, and I like them to actually understand what I'm saying. And so when I started looking at the trust literature, really it was focusing on uncertainty. And it was focusing not just on uncertainty, but a subset of uncertainty. It was really focused on us as individuals. And uncertainty doesn't just come from us. It also comes from the context that we're embedded in. And so once I started to reframe this conversation, it allowed me to explain why we trust some people without knowing anything about them or distrust them, right? And, we go to a restaurant, we get in a cab, we get on a plane. We don't know any of those people. We go see a doctor, right? We don't know them, but we trust them. And we engage in actions that look a lot like trust. The other piece that was missing for me was this, vulnerability is part of the equation, is part of the definition, but it wasn't being included in most of the literature. And so they were treating trust like a dichotomous variable, like an old-time light switch, right? It was either on or off. You either trusted people or you didn't. And as soon as I started saying, well, we trust some people more than others, everyone went, well, obvious, right? Like, that's so obvious. How did you get a PhD? And despite it being obvious, it doesn't show up in the literature. And when we first start talking about it to people, it's not where their mind goes. Their mind goes to close, tight personal relationships, to those really deep relationships, despite the fact that we trust people every day and that it's required for our society to function. And then there was a piece around, trust is often part of a repeated play. We have these relationships that aren't just one shot. You and I had a conversation. We're having another conversation. I'm hoping that we're going to have multiple conversations. And so your perception of the outcome has an impact on how much you trust me. And it's something that evolves over time. And so I need to understand that you interpret the world through stories, and that if I don't take an active role in that, then our perceptions might start to be different. And that could have a negative impact on our relationship moving forward. But if you and I start talking about what good looks like, which we did in the previous conversation we had, then we can work together towards getting there. And we can put resources against getting there. And it increases the probability that we're going to have a good interaction, a good exchange. And then in the middle of all this is our emotional states. The trust literature treats people like rational actors. And you and I have both met people. We know that we're not always rational. And this is part of I wrote my doctoral thesis on building trust in hostile environments. This is why we have these long-term disputes, is because we often take a really rational actor approach to fundamentally emotional problems. And so there were just a lot of gaps for me in the way that the model was being approached. And so there was a lot of ground to cover. Once I started framing it as a decision, it allowed me to look at different inputs and talk about a category of behaviors, instead of specific ones. So be transparent. Okay. Sometimes that's great and sometimes it isn't. And be authentic, is another rallying cry. Well, the folks that attacked the Capitol on January 6th were very authentic. They were not subtle at all. And that didn't provoke a huge outswelling of trust. And so for me, there's a real need for us to have conversations around what are the levers that promote trust levels and how do we intentionally pull them? And how do we help people understand the framework so that I'm not telling them what to do all the time, but instead they've got the model for themselves and they can start to skill build and frame it or move it so that it fits with their approach to the world.
Exactly. As you were talking about that, I kept on coming back to this idea of culture, and we'll often talk to people and they're like, culture, it's amorphous. It's like a cloud. You don't know. And then you say, no, culture it's behaviors. It's what do you do? And yes, how do you think? And then how you act. And I like the way you kind of frame that as what do we do? And if you said, do we agree that maybe in this relationship or this situation or this negotiation, we are not at the highest levels of trust? Yep. We all agree. Okay. Behaviorally, what can we do? What could you do? What are the alternatives and how we could behave that could increase that? That is a totally different question. And when I haven't asked that specific question, but kind of around it, like, what do we do here? Oftentimes it's hard to answer. It's easy to talk around it. It's hard to say, here is what we will do next. Let me ask you this. Is it possible, as you think, the difference between trust and vulnerability? Like, everybody wants trust. No one's going to say, I don't want that. But almost universally, if I would say to someone, you can correct me if I'm wrong. I'm sure there's people that I haven't researched this, but if I said, hey, do you want to feel vulnerable? Not really. I'd like to feel confident and strong, where I think most people, you say, would you like to feel vulnerable? Would you willingly feel vulnerable? Somewhere in in my lizard brain, I'm assuming, I'm hardwired to say, I'd prefer not to. Do I have to? Yeah. Right? Is it possible that's dichotomy and why most people don't want to write about it, or there's a lack of that in the literature?
Yes. And, there's an interesting conversation that Brene Brown had with the military when she started talking about vulnerability, and they said, we don't use that word here. And she said, how about the word courage? Do you use that? And they said, yeah, all the time. And she said, when's the last time you had courage without some level of vulnerability? And, my father was a welder with a grade 8 education. And I know that there's a discomfort around talking about vulnerability. And there's a discomfort around talking about trust itself because it feels so vague and fuzzy, and we're not sure what other people's definition is. And a big part of the work that I do is helping people have conversations. And, I worked with a leader who's a fantastic leader, but her organization measured trust levels for their leaders. Now, the trust measure wasn't great. And what they said was, this is really important, and if you don't do well on it, you're in trouble. But they didn't really have any suggestion for how to fix it if things went wrong. And so I got presented with this leader, and her score was 13 out of 100. And so we started having conversations and coaching, and then I went to her team with her, and I said, okay, so here are the different levers, right? Here's there's 10 levers that I write about in the book, and I'll list 4 of them here for your audience so that they can get a sense of it. And these are all from uncertainty, right? So there's 4 levers within uncertainty. 3 of them come from us as individuals. There's benevolence, integrity, and ability. And those are the ones that show up most often in the literature. And then there's the context. And so I said, benevolence is the belief you've got my best interest at heart. What could she do to help promote the understanding that she has your best interest at heart? What are your best interests? What does success look like for you? How does she help you get there? Integrity is I follow through on my promises and my actions line up with my values. So are there promises that have been made that haven't been followed through on, either by her or the organization? And what are the values that they're expressing, and are they following through on them? And ability, that's our favorite lever. I've got these kinds of credentials, this much experience, this background. But often we don't include other people in that conversation. What does good really look like? And so I said, what is an excellent leader? And you've had good leaders in the past. What are some of the things they did? What could she do? And then I talked about the context. Now, do you understand what her constraints are, who she reports to, what the incentives are for her, what her contract says? And now all of a sudden they had a framework to have a conversation. And I said, these are questions she's going to be asking you. So think about these. And her score went from 13 to 80 within a few months. And it's been at 100 since. And so we can have conversations about these things. And when we start stepping in and talking about vulnerability, we can talk about it in terms of, so what do you think's at stake here? What do you think's on the line? And, do you have good alternatives? Because the levers when we talk about vulnerability are, what do I think's at stake and how do I value it? And so what I do sort of in all my courses, I have a master class that's sort of 3 hours in length, 34 segments, each kind of about 5 minutes. And it includes role plays and exercises and all those kinds of things. But a lot of what it includes, much like the book, is these conversation starters, templates for conversations and questions that we can ask. And so it gives people a framework around having some of these conversations that doesn't feel as dangerous, doesn't feel as awkward. And once we start down this path of giving people things they can actually do, we start to see movement. We start to see behavior change. We start to actually see some pretty profound results.
I want to highlight one of these because one of these jumped off the page, and I'm trying to, probably forever, I don't know when, but trying to forever be a better podcast host. I appreciate the time that you are giving, and I'm learning a lot, and I love this, but I'm always thinking, what are the questions to ask? And here on page 156, I highlighted a couple where, a couple really easy questions. I'm like, yes, why don't we say this more? You said, what matters to you? What does success look like for you? Easy. This next one, though, it was like a punch to the gut. I'm like, oh my gosh, that is such a vulnerable question. It's, what would it look like to you if I were acting in your best interest? I'm going to repeat this. What would it look like to you if I were acting in your best interest? The idea that I would say this to a client, even though rationally, intellectually, that's a great question. How much more, important of a question could I ask? And yet the idea that I would ask that, it freaks me out. Like I'm instantly in a state of vulnerability, but it's like those sorts of things. How might you coach someone like me to say, well, hey man, you're meeting with these executives, you're meeting with these clients. If you recognize this is such an important question, just ask the question. And I'd say, rationally, Darryl, I know, but what if they...
Hard to get there.
Yeah, exactly. How might you coach somebody to do that?
So usually I start with a template, right? This is around the benevolence lever and how we pull it. And, I'm going to segue for a second here. I hope that's okay.
Yeah, please.
When I work with families, I'll ask them who here has their kid's best interest at heart. And all the hands go up, right? And when I say, how many of your kids would say that, it becomes about a third, and they're somewhat hesitant. And benevolence is an important lever. This belief that you got care and concern for the other party, it's actually probably I believe it's becoming more and more critical for us because things are moving so fast. The definition of excellence or ability is changing. It's a moving target. Integrity is getting harder because values are changing. It's harder to follow through on promises, especially if they're long-term, because the situation seems to evolve so quickly. And if parents are struggling to have benevolence land for their kids, then how the heck is a leader supposed to make it land for those they're leading? And for a lot of us, it feels dangerous to even be asking that question or talking about benevolence or someone's best interest. So what I do is I give people a template. I say, you're going to have a conversation with someone tomorrow. And here's the way it's going to go. You're going to say to them, I heard this guy, Darryl, he was talking about trust. He said that caring about other people and having that come across, or benevolence is the word he used, is really important. And I think I do that. I think I act in people's best interest often, but it doesn't always seem to land that way. Have you ever experienced that? And the other person's going to say, yes, I have. And they will hopefully expand on it a bit more and tell you about situations. Then we start to narrow the funnel a bit and we say, have you ever had somebody really have your back? What did they do? Like, what did that look like? How did you know? What was the feeling around that? And maybe you share a story about a time when someone really looked out for you to help prime the pump. But as they start to tell that story, you're getting hints about what benevolence looks like for them. And then we narrow the funnel further because we've primed it, we're easing into this conversation, and we say, what would it look like if I was benevolent to you? Like, what does success look like for you? How do I help you get there? And now we have the opportunity to create transparency. And now we have the opportunity to be able to say, okay, so this is what you told me. And people mistake this notion of benevolence for being nice. It's not always about being nice. Sometimes it's about holding people to higher account. Sometimes it's about looking out for their best interest when they're struggling to do that themselves. And if I'm a leader and someone comes to me and says, I'd like to get a promotion, I want to evolve in my career, then the appropriate response for a leader is to say, great. So that means I'm going to start holding you more accountable. I'm going to start looking for the traits of someone in that next role. I'm going to start pushing you to be a bit more uncomfortable. And I'm going to start putting you in the spotlight a bit more, giving you more responsibility. Because often it's the case that I'm not the only one who makes that decision about whether you get promoted or not. I have to be able to justify it to others and to the rest of the team. Everyone has to see that you're ready for that role and that it makes sense for you to step into it. So I need to see you starting to act like you're ready for that role even before I put you in it. Once we've got this narrative in place, once we've got this story in place, then starting to hold people to higher account, starting to push them harder is interpreted. We interpret the world through stories. It's interpreted as me being on their side. I had that experience with my son. He wanted to get a baseball scholarship. And I said, well, that means you've got to be a good teammate. It means you've got to get along well with your coaches. It means you've got to work hard. You got to do well in school. You're going to have to exercise and eat well. There's all these things that go into you achieving that goal. And now all of a sudden I'm asking him and nudging him about these things that most parents would get pushback for. Most parents would be like, oh, get off my back. But for him, the story is Dad's got my back. He's in my corner. He's trying to help me get where I want to go. And I got to tell you, when people first start trying these exercises and they start trying to apply these concepts, because in every course I deliver, I get people to pick a trust buddy. I get them to pick someone they're going to practice with. And overwhelmingly, the response is, that seemed like it should be easy. It felt awkward. But man, was the response ever positive. It's clearly something that I need to keep working at to get better, to add to my toolkit, to be part of the way that I lead or engage. But boy, I got to tell you, being clear and transparent about my intentions, the other person was just all over it. They were like, yeah, let's figure this out.
It's interesting to me to think about if we could evaluate trust and say, this is arguably the most important thing that I need to engender and convey to help me be successful personally and professionally. And we know it's big and we know it's nuanced and we know there's a lot of perception involved and how you see it versus I see it. Why would I think I'd be able to ace this the first time out? Why isn't there this concept of practice of put yourself in a low risk environment? By the way, even if I ask this question, to a client, what would it look like to you if I were acting in your best interest? Even if this goes nowhere and the person looks at me like I have three heads and says, I don't even know what that means. And I say,
right.
You know what? I'm just trying to figure out how you and I can really, envision a future together that we both want to get to and reverse engineer it.
Right.
Even if I totally botch it, that individual probably is going to say, yeah, I don't know what the hell that question was, but yeah, I'm in. Whatever you're trying to do, I kind of like it. Like, there's no downside where someone's going to get angry with you as you try to figure out how you can allow us to collaborate, with more trust.
And you're going to find a way that feels comfortable and fits with your approach to the world and your approach to clients. And it may be as simple as saying, look, I want you to be successful. What does that mean for you? And how do I help you get there? And boy, I got to tell you, I don't think a lot of people would be saying, well, up yours, like they're going to be saying, okay, this is what success looks like for me.
Yeah.
Let's row in the same direction.
And I'm sure you have found this too, when you're working with clients and they cannot clearly articulate the goals and the objectives of what they're trying to do and how they're trying to get there. And you say, well, if you don't know, it's going to be tough for anybody to get there. What if we worked on this together? And if you and I just clarified what you're trying to do and where you're trying to go, now you and I may choose to work together or not, right? And we could talk about that. But if I'm able to help you clarify what you're trying to do and where you want to go, might that be valuable? Like, hell yeah, right? Yeah, absolutely.
Exactly. Well, and I've sat, and this has taken a while. Like my learning and development is still an ongoing. I'm still not a finished product by any stretch of the imagination. But I would try having two people sitting in the same room and saying, okay, so what would benevolence look like from you to you? And the two of them just look at me like deer in the headlights, right? I don't know. And I had an executive and her direct report, and I said, what would it look like if you were benevolent to her? And I asked the direct report the same question, and they were just stuck. And I said, you're part of a global organization, and she's just been talking about how much she loves to travel. Are there not roles within this organization where travel would be part of her job? Well, yeah. And could she not grow and develop and evolve into one of those roles that would be a beautiful alignment of her passions and her work? And they looked at each other and went, wow, oh my God, that's completely possible. And so I was thinking, like, good Lord, how did they not just see that immediately? And partly it's we need to help people move into that conversation. So part of the priming mechanism of saying, what did it look like when somebody had your back? What did it look like when someone had your best interest at heart? Helps them think about those things and helps them think about what are my best interests, And for me, I've spent a lot of time thinking about this. Like I'm trying to have a broader impact in the world. I want the world to be a better place. And another part of my dedication was to my two sons, who I want to be a better person and I want the world to be a better place for them. And we're facing some really complex problems that require collective collaborative action for us to solve. And we need trust more than ever. And it's scarcer than it's ever been. I have a deep sense of frustration around that. So I appreciate you and your audience.
Yeah, well, I'm watching the time here. And again, I think this is where I'm going to tee this up for you. For you guys who are watching, this is his book, Building Trust, Exceptional Leadership in an Uncertain World. And for those listening, for the construction community, whether it's labor shortages, whether it's volatile commodity pricing, whether it's risk that has been really shoved back up, kind of the chain of command, if you will, and is now being pressed back down, inventory availability, like the construction community is a microcosm of what you're talking about in the world. Like there's a lot of things that are new and a lot of things that are intransigent that have just been there that are still here, and trust is a way through that. So let's make it perfectly obvious. I do not want to bury the lead, and I appreciate your time and I appreciate your book. Strongly recommend people to buy this. And again, I would just say is if you regularly buy books and you share them or you don't, it doesn't matter. If there's the recognition that trust is important for growing your business and enjoying how you help your customers, I would say also there's a lot of elements of this about made me think about how I behave with my own kids and my own wife and my own family. So it's not just professional, but where can people buy the book? Where can people learn more about your masterclasses? Where can people connect with you? Don't be subtle. Let's just make it really obvious where people can go as terms of a next step, Darryl.
Yeah, so I would love it if people bought the book and not just bought it, but read it and started to apply it. You can get it anywhere online, Amazon or wherever you buy books online. It's available as an ebook, an audiobook, and a paperback like you have. Actually, it's a hardcover, I think. They can reach out to me at trustunlimited.com, and that's where you can find the masterclass. There's also a deeper sort of 8-week course that I offer that includes elements of one-on-one coaching. You can reach out to me at Darryl@trustunlimited.com. That's my email address. And if you go to Trust Unlimited and look at the About section, you can see Drake. There's a picture of him there. He's the Director of Goodness, the DOG for my company. There's a blog section with articles and other podcasts. And just, I really hope that your listeners will help us move the cause forward. and create greater awareness about how trust works and how to build it.
Well, I think if they do, they can be employing their own personal self-interest while I think also differentiating themselves and standing out as better partners, which I know our audience. I know that's what they want, and that's why they're listening. And Darryl, thank you for your time. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much.
All right, then, friend, how did that go? Hopefully you enjoyed my conversation with Dr. Darryl Stickel. Again, I'd recommend his book, Building Trust, Exceptional Leadership in an Uncertain World. If you found aspects of this conversation valuable and you would like to share them, obviously you are listening to this as a podcast. We also are recording nearly every episode moving forward and putting segments of our conversation and the whole thing in video on YouTube. So you can go to Bradley Hartman & Co. and you can see all sorts of videos. Why? Why are we doing this? Our goal is to make this easier to share. These little insights on something as important as trust. We want to make sure these are easy for you to listen to and then share with people to help them become better leaders. That's it. It's 100% free. You can find it there. When you're there, subscribe. So every week when we're putting out new content, you have access to it and can be a better leader and bring your team with you on your own leadership journey. Also, if you did receive value from this conversation with Dr. Darryl Stickel, please leave us a review on the podcast player you are listening to. Those mean more to us than you know. This episode was brought to you by the Simple Sales Pipeline. For under $30 per month, requiring less than 30 minutes per month, every sales rep or BDR in your team can value and organize the future sales they have. We need to do a better job forecasting to build a more realistic pipeline to quantify what's going to happen in the future so we can adjust our behaviors if we don't like the way that we are trending. This has never been more important given the uncertain economic times that we are in. You can learn more at thesimpleSalesPipeline.com. All right, friends, that's all I've got. We're to close out with our leadership mantra. You are owed nothing. Deliver value first. Make it a great week.